I never thought a simple no to a $12 taxi fare would completely transform my life. But that rainy Tuesday morning, when I saw that elderly veteran struggling with his crutches outside the VA hospital, something inside me changed. What happened next wasn't just unexpected. It altered the course of my entire future. This is the story of how refusing payment from one passenger led to an extraordinary chain of events that I still can't believe happened to me. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button and notification bell to never miss another incredible story like this one. The dashboard clock blinked 5:45 a.m. as Jack Reynolds steered his yellow taxi through the quiet streets of Portland. Morning fog rolled in from the Willamette River, wrapping the city's buildings in an ethereal haze. At 26, Jack wasn't like most taxi drivers in the city. While others complained about the early shifts, he found peace in these pre-dawn hours when the world was still coming alive. He pulled into his usual spot outside Pioneer Square, cutting the engine but leaving the heat running. February in Portland meant bone-chilling dampness that seemed to seep through every crack. The worn leather seat creaked as he leaned back, pulling out the day's newspaper and a thermos of coffee that was already half empty. The taxi itself had seen better days. The 2012 Toyota Camry had been his father's pride and joy before the accident 3 years ago. Now it served as both Jack's livelihood and his last connection to the man who taught him everything about hard work and treating people right. The Reynolds family taxi service decal on the door was fading, but Jack couldn't bring himself to replace it. His phone buzzed, another text from his landlord about the overdue rent. Jack sighed, sliding the phone back into his pocket. Between the car repairs, his mother's medical bills, and the rising cost of living in Portland, staying afloat felt like treading water in a storm. But complaining wouldn't change anything. His dad always said that tough times don't last, but tough people do. The early morning regulars started appearing like clockwork. Mrs. Chen heading to her bakery, briefcase-carrying executives rushing to catch the early train to Seattle, and college students stumbling home from late-night study sessions. Jack knew all their stories, their routines, their small talk. It wasn't much, but these little connections made the job feel less lonely. As the sun began to peek through the clouds, casting long shadows between the buildings, Jack noticed something different about today's rhythm. The usual morning bustle seemed subdued, as if the city itself was holding its breath for something unexpected. He pulled out his logbook, reviewing yesterday's fares, while absently watching pedestrians hurry past his window. The numbers weren't great, but they rarely were these days. Ever since those ride-sharing apps took over, traditional taxi drivers like him had to work twice as hard for half the income. Still, he refused to switch. This taxi wasn't just a job, it was his father's legacy. The coffee shop across the street was starting to fill up, the smell of fresh pastries and espresso drifting through his slightly cracked window. Jack checked his wallet, $23 and some change. Not enough for breakfast, but enough for lunch, if he was careful. His mother always insisted on packing him morning snacks, even now, but he'd forgotten the paper bag on his kitchen counter this morning. A light drizzle started, creating a soft patter on the taxi's roof. Jack watched as people hurried by, collars turned up against the weather, umbrellas blooming like sudden flowers on the sidewalk. Each person passing his cab was a potential fare, a possible story, maybe even the one that could turn his luck around. His father used to say that every passenger was an opportunity, not just for money, but for making a difference in someone's day. The taxi's radio crackled with dispatcher updates, a familiar background noise that had become as natural as breathing. Jack reached over to adjust the volume, his fingers brushing against the small photograph tucked into the sun visor. It showed him and his father standing proudly in front of this very taxi when it was new, both wearing matching caps with the Reynolds family taxi service logo. The edges were worn from years of being handled, but the smiles remained as bright as ever. He was about to start his usual morning route when his phone buzzed again. This time it was his sister Claire, probably checking if he was coming to her son's birthday party this weekend. He'd been putting off telling her he couldn't afford a gift right now. Family gatherings had become increasingly difficult to navigate. Since his father's passing, too many concerned looks, too many well-meaning suggestions about other career options. The morning light was stronger now, burning through the last wisps of fog. Jack straightened his collar, adjusted his rearview mirror, and took one last sip of lukewarm coffee. Time to face another day. He had no way of knowing that in just a few hours, a simple decision would set in motion events that would change everything, not just for him, but for countless others. As he pulled away from the curb, the city was fully awake now, its streets filling with the usual morning symphony of horns, footsteps, and distant construction. Jack merged into traffic, his mind already planning the most efficient routes through the growing congestion. Today felt different somehow, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. Maybe it was just wishful thinking, or maybe, just maybe, this would be the day when everything changed. If only he knew how right that feeling would turn out to be. The morning rush had died down when Jack pulled into the parking lot of the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Portland's Hills. The imposing brick building stood against the gray sky like a sentinel, its American flag hanging limp in the still air. He often parked here between fares. Something about the quiet dignity of the place reminded him of his father, though Richard Reynolds had never served. Through the drizzle, Jack noticed movement near the hospital's main entrance. An elderly man stood beneath the overhang, one hand gripping a wooden cane, the other clutching what looked like discharge papers. What caught Jack's attention wasn't the man's military bearing, still evident despite his stooped posture, but the way he kept checking his watch. Anxiety clear in every movement. The man wore a weathered Vietnam veteran cap, its edges frayed, but the insignia still proud. His jacket had the neat, pressed look of someone who'd never lost the habit of military precision, even if life had worn down its edges. A small duffel bag sat at his feet, olive green canvas marked with faded stenciling that Jack couldn't quite make out from this distance. Jack watched as the man attempted to flag down passing cars, each one speeding past without slowing. The veteran's shoulders seemed to sink lower with each rejection. Something about the scene struck a chord deep within Jack. It reminded him of those final days in the hospital with his father, when the world had felt so overwhelmingly large and indifferent. The rain was picking up now, fat drops beginning to blow under the overhang. The veteran took an unsteady step backward, his cane slipping slightly on the wet concrete. Before Jack could think twice, he was pulling his taxi up to the curb. Rolling. Down his window, Jack called out, "Need a ride, sir?" The man turned, surprise flickering across his weather-lined face. Up close, Jack could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the kind that seemed bone-deep. A small medical alert bracelet glinted on his wrist, catching the fluorescent light from the hospital entrance. "I appreciate it, son," the man said, his voice gravelly but warm. "But I should warn you, I'm headed to Gresham. It's not a short trip, and He hesitated, dignity warring with necessity. "I won't be able to pay until my pension check comes through next week." Jack's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Gresham was at least a 30-minute drive in good traffic, and with the rain picking up, it would likely take longer. The fuel gauge needle hovered just above a quarter tank. His landlord's text about the rent seemed to burn in his pocket. But then he noticed something else about the veteran, a small purple heart pin on his jacket lapel, partially hidden by his collar. Jack's grandfather had earned one of those in Korea. He'd never gotten to meet the man, but his father had kept that purple heart in a small display case in their living room, a reminder of sacrifice and duty. "Let me help you with that bag." "Sir," Jack heard himself say, already opening his door. The veteran began to protest, but Jack was already out in the rain, hefting the surprisingly heavy duffel bag into the taxi's trunk. "Name's Jack Reynolds," he said, opening the back door. "Reynolds Family Taxi Service. Been running in Portland since my dad started it 20 years ago." The veteran settled into the back seat with careful movements that spoke of recent medical procedures. "William Cooper," he replied, "but most people just call me Bill. You sure about this, son? Gresham's not exactly around the corner." Jack caught Bill's eye in the rearview mirror as he pulled away from the curb. "My father always said a man's word was worth more than what's in his wallet. If you say you're good for it next week, that's good enough for me." Bill's reflection showed a flash of something, surprise perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "Was," Jack corrected softly, navigating through the hospital complex. "Lost him 3 years ago. Car accident on a night a lot like this one." A moment of understanding silence filled the cab.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"I'm sorry to hear that, son," Bill said finally. "Losing the good ones. It leaves a hole that never quite fills up, doesn't it?" Jack nodded, throat tight. Through the windshield, Portland's familiar streets stretched out before them, the rain creating halos around the traffic lights. As they merged onto the highway, Bill spoke again, his voice taking on a distant quality. "You know, I haven't been back to this VA center since '85. Swore I'd never set foot in another hospital after Nam, but sometimes life doesn't give you much choice, does it?" Jack glanced in the mirror again, noting the way Bill's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his cap. "Rough visit?" he asked gently. A bitter chuckle escaped the older man. "Let's just say some wounds don't show up on x-rays. Doctor says I need to start coming in regular for some new treatment program twice a week, if you can believe it. Don't know how I'm going to manage it. My daughter used to drive me to appointments, but she's got her hands full with the grandkids now." The implications hung in the air. Twice weekly trips to Portland, each one a taxi fare he couldn't afford. Jack thought about his own mother, how she'd insisted on taking 3 buses rather than ask for rides to her cancer treatments after his father died. Pride was a double-edged sword sometimes. They were passing through East Portland now, the industrial districts giving way to residential neighborhoods. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm, and traffic was lighter than usual. Bill had fallen silent, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery, but his reflection in the window showed a man lost in thought. Jack's mind wandered to the stack of bills waiting at home, to his sister's son's birthday party he still couldn't afford a gift for, to the repairs his taxi desperately needed. A twice-weekly fare to Gresham would have been a godsend a few months ago. Now, looking at Bill's purple heart pin and remembering his father's voice saying that some debts couldn't be measured in dollars, Jack knew what he had to do. He cleared his throat. "You know, Mr. Cooper, I drive past Gresham pretty regularly for other fares." This was a lie, but Jack pressed on. "If you need rides to your appointments, maybe we could work something out. Veterans, discount and all that." Bill's eyes snapped to the rearview mirror, sharp despite their weariness. "Son, I may be old, but I'm not looking for charity." "Not charity?" Jack said firmly, remembering how his father used to negotiate with customers who were down on their luck. "Think of it as an investment in karma. Besides, gives me an excuse to grab coffee at that diner out on Powell. They make it like my dad used to." The rest of the drive passed in comfortable conversation. Bill sharing stories about his time in the service, Jack talking about growing up in the family taxi business. By the time they pulled up to Bill's modest house in Gresham, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the world with that fresh-washed feeling that followed Portland storms. As Bill reached for the door handle, Jack made a decision. "Here," he said, pulling one of his business cards from the visor and scribbling his cell number on the back. "Call me directly when you need a ride, anytime, day or night." Bill held the card for a long moment, studying it with an intensity that seemed to go beyond the simple information printed there. Finally, he tucked it carefully into his wallet. "You're a rare breed, Jack Reynolds," he said. "They don't make many like you anymore." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Your father would be proud." Jack watched as Bill made his way up the short path to his front door, waving once before disappearing inside. As he pulled away from the curb, Jack felt a curious mixture of emotions: concern about the lost fare warring with a sense of having done exactly what his father would have wanted. He had no way of knowing that this simple act of kindness, this decision to listen to his heart rather than his wallet, was about to set in motion a chain of events that would reshape not just his life, but the lives of countless others in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The late afternoon sun had broken through Portland's clouds when Jack's phone buzzed. The number wasn't saved in his contacts, but something made him answer instead of letting it go to voicemail like he usually did with unknown calls. "Reynolds Family Taxi Service," he answered, pulling into an empty parking spot near Portland State University. "Jack?" The gravelly voice was immediately recognizable. "It's Bill Cooper, from the VA hospital last week." There was an uncertainty in his tone, as if he wasn't sure Jack would remember him. Jack smiled, adjusting his rearview mirror out of habit. "Of course, Mr. Cooper. How are you doing?" "Been better, son." Bill's voice carried a weight that hadn't been there during their first meeting. "That treatment the doc started, well, let's just say it's taking more out of me than I expected. Got another appointment tomorrow morning. I hate to ask, but what time should I pick you up?" Jack cut in, already reaching for his logbook. The relief in Bill's voice was palpable. 8 a.m. if it's not too much trouble. But listen, I want to be clear about payment. I got my pension check so I can cover last week's fare and tomorrow's up front. Jack glanced at his fuel gauge. The needle was hovering dangerously close to empty. The smart move would be to accept the payment. His landlord had left another voicemail this morning, and the taxi's insurance was due next week. But something in Bill's voice, that hint of strain beneath the military precision, made Jack's decision for him. "Tell you what, Mr. Cooper," Jack said, thinking of how his father used to handle similar situations. "Why don't we forget about last week? And tomorrow, instead of worrying about the fare, you can buy us both coffee at that diner you mentioned on Powell Boulevard. I've been meaning to try it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Bill spoke again, his voice was gruff with emotion. "You're something else, kid. Your father must have been one hell of a man to raise a son like you." The comment hit Jack harder than he expected. He managed throat tight. 8 a.m. tomorrow then?" "I'll be ready," Bill confirmed. "And Jack, thank you." The next morning arrived with unusual clarity for Portland in February. The last sunrise painted the sky in streaks of pink and gold, and the air carried the first hints of approaching spring. Jack pulled up to Bill's house at 7:55 a.m., noticing small details he'd missed on his first visit: the carefully tended flower beds, the American flag mounted beside the door, the ramp recently added to the front steps. Before he could step out to help Bill emerge from the house, he moved slower than last week, but his clothes were pressed with military precision, and his veteran's cap sat at the same exact angle. What caught Jack's attention, though, was the ancient leather briefcase clutched in Bill's free hand, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. "Morning, son," Bill greeted as Jack helped him into the back seat. "Hope you're hungry. That diner makes the best breakfast in 3 counties." The drive into Portland was different this time. Maybe it was the morning light, or maybe it was the way Bill seemed more at ease, but the silence felt comfortable, like a conversation between old friends. "Mind if I ask you something?" Bill said suddenly, as they waited at a red light. What made you keep your father's taxi business going? Can't be easy these days, with all these fancy ride-share apps and such. Jack watched the light change, carefully merging into traffic before responding. Honestly, some days I ask myself the same question. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Dad started this business with one car and a dream of being his own boss. He used to say that a taxi driver was part therapist, part tour guide, and part guardian angel. People trust us with more than just their safety, he'd tell me. They trust us with their stories. Bill's reflection nodded in the rearview mirror. Smart man. You know, that's what's missing these days, that human connection. Everyone's so busy looking at their phones, they forget to look at each other. They pulled into the diner's parking lot, the neon open sign buzzing cheerfully in the window. Jack started to protest when Bill insisted on helping him out of the car, but the older man waved him off. I may be beat up, but I'm not broken, Bill said with a wink. Besides, I got something to show you. Inside the diner was a time capsule of 1950s Americana, red vinyl booths, chrome fixtures, and the smell of coffee and bacon hanging thick in the air. A waitress named Ruby, her silver hair swept up in a neat bun, greeted Bill by name and led them to a corner booth. Your usual bill? She asked, already pouring coffee into thick white mugs. You know me too well, Ruby, Bill chuckled. Jack here will have the same. As Ruby walked away, Bill reached for the leather briefcase he'd brought. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, but his movements were deliberate, almost reverent. Been meaning to show someone these for a while now, he said, pulling out a stack of weathered photographs. Figured you might appreciate them. The first photo showed a group of young soldiers standing in front of a helicopter, their faces bright with youth and determination. Bill pointed to one of them, and Jack felt a jolt of recognition. The young man's smile was the same one he'd seen in his rearview mirror. That's my unit, Bill explained, his voice soft with memory. Taken 3 days before we flew into the Ashar Valley. Half of those boys never made it home. He continued through the photos, each one a window into a different time. Bill in his dress uniform at his wedding, Bill holding his newborn daughter, Bill standing proud in front of his own small business, a hardware store he'd run for 30 years before retiring. Lost touch with most of the ones who made it back, Bill said, carefully returning the photos to his briefcase. War has a way of scattering people, but lately I've been thinking about connections, about how sometimes the strangest things bring people together. Ruby returned with their breakfast, massive plates of eggs, hash browns, and what had to be half a pig's worth of bacon. As they ate, Bill shared more stories, not just about the war, but about life, love, loss, and the journey of finding purpose again after everything changes. Jack found himself opening up too, talking about his struggles to keep the business going, his worry about his mother's health, his fear of letting down his father's legacy. The food grew cold as they talked, but neither seemed to notice. As the morning crowd began to thin, Bill pulled one last item from his briefcase, a folded piece of paper that looked official. Got some news yesterday, he said, his voice carefully neutral. That new treatment they want me to try, insurance won't cover most of it. Doc says it could really help, but... He trailed off, staring into his coffee cup. Jack felt a familiar twist in his gut. The same feeling he got whenever he had to choose between paying bills or buying groceries. Before he could speak, Bill straightened his shoulders, a flash of that military bearing returning. But that's not your problem, he said firmly. I've lived through worse. Now let me settle up with Ruby, and we can head to that appointment. As Bill made his way to the register, Jack remained in the booth, his mind racing. He thought about his father's words about being more than just a taxi driver, about connections and purpose and doing what's right even when it's hard. What he didn't know then was that this moment, this simple breakfast in a retro diner with a Vietnam veteran, was about to lead to something far bigger than either of them could imagine. Sometimes the most profound changes start with the smallest gestures, like sharing coffee with a stranger who's quickly becoming a friend. The VA hospital's waiting room was quieter than usual when Jack returned to pick up Bill after his appointment. Through the large windows, he could see the afternoon sun fighting a losing battle with gathering storm clouds. He'd spent the morning doing short runs around Portland, but his mind kept drifting back to the breakfast conversation, to those weathered photographs, to the unspoken weight behind Bill's words about his treatment. Jack checked his phone, 2:47 p.m. Bill's appointment had run over by almost an hour. The text from his sister Claire still sat unanswered. "Mum's not doing great. Can you cover her medication this month? I'm tapped out." He'd been avoiding it all day, just like he'd been avoiding the bank's calls about his overdue car payment. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and Bill emerged, looking more drained than Jack had ever seen him. His usual military posture was gone, replaced by a weariness that seemed to seep from his bones. In his hand, he clutched a stack of papers, medical forms, prescriptions, and what looked like a billing statement. "Mr. Cooper?" Jack stepped forward, concern evident in his voice. "Everything okay?" Bill managed a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Been better, son, Doc says." He paused, swaying slightly. Jack quickly moved to support him, noting how the older man's hand trembled as he gripped his cane. "Let's get you home," Jack said firmly, helping Bill to the taxi. The sky had darkened considerably, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall as they pulled away from the hospital. They drove in silence for several blocks, the rhythm of the windshield wipers marking time. Jack kept glancing in his rear view mirror, watching as Bill stared at the papers in his lap, his expression growing more defeated with each passing minute. Finally, at a red light, Bill spoke. "You ever feel like life's got a twisted sense of humor, Jack?" His voice was rough, with emotion. "Survived Vietnam, ran a business for 30 years, did everything right. Now they're telling me this treatment could add years to my life, maybe even let me see my grandkids graduate, but without insurance coverage." He trailed off, shaking. His head, Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He thought about his father's voice. "Sometimes the biggest tips come from the rides you give for free." The light turned green, but instead of heading toward Gresham, Jack made a sudden decision. He turned right, toward the riverfront. "This isn't the way to my house," Bill observed, confusion evident in his tone. "No, sir, it's not," Jack agreed, pulling into a small park overlooking the Willamette River. The rain had intensified, drumming on the taxi's roof and turning the world beyond the windows into a grey blur. He put the car in park and turned to face Bill. "My father," Jack began, his voice steady despite the emotion building in his chest. He had this saying about taxi drivers being guardian angels sometimes. "When I was younger, I thought he was just being dramatic. But now, I think I understand what he meant." Bill sat quietly, waiting. "Those treatments," Jack continued, "how often would they be?" "Twice a week for the next 3 months, Bill replied. "But son, I already told you, I can't." Jack held up his hand. "Every Tuesday and Thursday, I'm going to pick you up at 7:30 a.m. We'll have breakfast at Ruby's, then head to your appointment. After that, I'll take you home. No charge." Bill's face darkened. "Absolutely not. I won't accept charity, especially not from someone who's got their own struggles." "I see those calls you're avoiding on your phone, Jack. I know what financial pressure looks like." "It's not charity," Jack said firmly, turning fully in his seat to meet Bill's gaze. "It's an investment in both of us." He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out his father's old business ledger, its pages worn smooth with use. "Dad kept track of every fare he ever gave in this book, but look at the margins." He passed the book back to Bill, who took it with careful hands. In the margins of each page were small notes, Mrs. Johnson, husband in hospital. Tom K., lost job, 3 kids. Sarah M., mother's funeral. Next to each note was a small check mark. "These were the free rides?" Bill asked, running his fingers over the faded ink. Jack nodded. Dad called them his karma rides, said they always came back tenfold in unexpected ways. He believed in people, in community, in doing right even when it was hard. He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've been trying to figure out how to honor his legacy. Maybe this is it." The rain continued to fall outside, creating a cocoon of privacy around them. Bill stared at the ledger for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Your father," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "He would have gotten along well with my old commanding officer, man named Martinez. Always said that the measure of a soldier wasn't how many battles he won, but how many of his brothers he carried home." He carefully closed the ledger, hands steady for the first time since leaving the hospital. "I can't let you do this, Jack. It's too much." "With all due respect, sir," Jack replied, a small smile playing at his corners of his mouth, "you don't have a choice. I'm not offering you free rides. I'm offering you partnership in testing my father's karma theory." Despite himself, Bill chuckled. "You're as stubborn as an old sergeant I used to know." "Must have learned it from my dad," Jack said. "So, do we have a deal? Breakfast at Ruby's twice a week?" Bill was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the rain-swept river. When he turned back, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Your father raised one hell of a son, Jack Reynolds. Is that a yes?" "On one condition," Bill said, straightening his shoulders. "You let me tell you some stories, real ones, about what it means to find light in dark places, about brothers, looking out for each other, stories that need to be heard." Jack extended his hand to the back seat. "Deal." As they shook hands, the rain began to ease, and a shaft of late afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds, reflecting off the river in a sudden burst of gold. Neither man could know it then, but this moment, this choice, made in a taxi overlooking the Willamette River, would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just their lives, but their entire community. Jack put the taxi back in drive and pulled away from the riverfront. As they headed toward Gresham, Bill began to tell a story about his first day in Vietnam, about a young medic who'd saved his life before he'd even seen combat. His voice was stronger now, filled with purpose. In the driver's seat, Jack felt something shift inside him. The weight of his financial troubles, his mother's health issues, his sister's struggles, they were all still there. But somehow, they felt more manageable. His father had always said that the solution to your own problems often lay in helping solve someone else's. The radio played softly in the background as they drove through the clearing weather, both men unaware that their simple agreement, 2 weekly rides, 2 shared breakfasts, 2 lives intersecting, was about to blossom into something far more significant than either could imagine. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. For Jack Reynolds, it started with saying no to payment from a veteran on a rainy Tuesday morning. For Bill Cooper, it started with accepting help from a young taxi driver who reminded him of the brothers he'd lost. For both of them, it was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey. The neon signs of downtown Portland blurred in Jack's windshield as he drove through the evening traffic. After dropping Bill off, he'd thrown himself into work, taking fare after fare, as if the constant motion could help him process the magnitude of what he'd just committed to. Now, as the city settled into its nighttime rhythm, the full weight of his decision began to sink in. Pulling into an empty spot near Pioneer Square, Jack cut the engine but left the radio playing softly, an old Johnny Cash song his father used to love. He pulled out his phone, finally ready to face the reality of his finances. The screen lit up with a cascade of notifications. 3 missed calls from his landlord, a text from his sister about their mother's medications, and an email from the bank about his overdue car payment. With steady hands, he opened his taxi service app and began calculating. 2 free rides to Gresham and back, twice a week for 3 months. Factor in gas, wear and tear, lost potential fares during those hours. The total made his stomach clench. It was more than he could afford, much more. "What would you do, Dad?" he whispered, touching the worn leather of the steering wheel. The answer came immediately in his father's voice. "The right thing is rarely the easy thing, Jackie boy." A tap on his window startled him from his thoughts. It was Miguel, the night janitor from the office building next door. Jack had given him rides home during bad weather more times than he could count. "Everything okay, amigo?" Miguel asked as Jack rolled down the window. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world in there." Jack managed a smile. "Just doing some math, Miguel. Sometimes the numbers don't want to add up." Miguel nodded sagely, leaning against the taxi. "My madre used to say that God's calculator works different than ours. Sometimes the less you have, the more you can give." He paused, then added, "You know, ever since you helped me during that snowstorm last month, I've been telling everyone about Reynolds family taxi service. Even got you that corporate client, right?" Jack straightened in his seat. He'd almost forgotten. The law firm Miguel cleaned for had started using his taxi service for their late working employees. It wasn't huge money, but it was steady. "That came from you?" Miguel grinned. "What goes around comes around, no? My madre was right about that calculator." After Miguel left, Jack sat in thoughtful silence. He pulled out his father's old ledger again, flipping through the pages of karma rides. Each entry told a story, not just of people in need, but of connections made, of trust given and returned. His phone buzzed again, another text from Claire. "Jack, please call me. It's about Mom." This time he didn't hesitate to dial. His sister answered on the first ring. "Finally." Claire's voice was tight with worry. "Mom's medications." The pharmacy called. The price went up again. "I've tried everything, but I'm maxed out. I hate to ask." "How much?" Jack asked, already knowing he couldn't afford it. "600, Claire said softly. "I know it's impossible right now. I don't know what to do anymore." Jack looked at his father's ledger, at the careful columns of numbers and notes. "Let me figure something out," he said. "Give me until tomorrow." After hanging up, he started the taxi again. The night shift was usually good for fares. He could put in a few extra hours, maybe make a dent in what they needed. But as he pulled away from the curb, his mind kept drifting back to Bill's face when he'd offered the free rides, to Miguel's words about his mother's calculator. He found himself driving past his usual spots, heading instead toward the Riverside Park where he'd made his decision earlier. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and clean. He parked in the same spot, looking out over the water where the city lights danced on the dark surface. Opening his glove compartment, Jack pulled out an old photograph he kept tucked behind his insurance papers. It showed his father standing proudly beside this very taxi on the day he'd bought it. Richard Reynolds wasn't looking at the camera. Instead, he was helping an elderly woman with her groceries, his face lit with a genuine smile. "The measure of success isn't in your bank account," his father used to say. "It's in the difference you make in someone's day." Jack took out his phone again, but instead of checking his banking app, he opened his contact list. He scrolled until he found the number for Pete, his old high school friend, who now managed a local pharmacy chain. "Hey, Pete," he said when his friend answered. "Remember how you said you owed me one after I drove your sister home from the hospital last month? I need to ask a favor." 20 minutes later, Jack had worked out an arrangement with Pete, a discount program for his mother's medications. In exchange for providing reliable transport for some of the pharmacy's elderly customers, who had trouble picking up their prescriptions. It wasn't a complete solution to his financial troubles, but it was a start. More importantly, it felt right, like something his father would have done. As if on cue, his phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. "Jack, it's Bill's daughter. Rebecca, Dad told me what you're doing for him. I'd love to meet you for coffee tomorrow if you're free. There's something I'd like to discuss." Jack stared at the message for a long moment, thinking about his father's karma rides, about Miguel's mother's calculator, about the way small acts of kindness seem to ripple outward in unexpected ways. He typed back a quick response. "Coffee. Sounds great. Ruby's Diner at 10? Rebecca's reply came almost immediately. "Perfect. And Jack, thank you for what you're doing for my father. It means more than you know." Starting the taxi again, Jack felt a curious lightness despite the weight of his financial concerns. He thought about Bill's photographs, about the brothers in arms who had carried each other through dark times. Maybe that's what this was about. Not just giving free rides, but carrying each other through the hard parts of life. The night was still young, and the streets of Portland were full of people who might need a ride, might have a story to tell, might be part of this growing web of connections he was somehow weaving. Jack pulled away from the riverside, ready to face whatever came next. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that his coffee meeting with Rebecca tomorrow would open up possibilities he hadn't even imagined. Sometimes the universe has a way of multiplying kindness, of turning small acts of generosity into something far greater than the sum of its parts. For now, though, Jack was content to drive through his city, his father's city, carrying forward a legacy of karma rides and unexpected connections. The math might not add up on paper, but maybe Miguel's mother had been right about God's calculator working differently. Maybe some equations could only be balanced with trust, with kindness, with faith in the ripple effects of doing what's right. As he turned onto Burnside Street, a light rain began to fall again, soft and gentle, like a blessing on the city and all its interconnected stories. Jack Reynolds, son of Richard Reynolds, keeper of the Karma Rides legacy, drove on into the night, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. Ruby's Diner looked different in the morning light. Jack arrived early, parking his taxi in the same spot he'd used with Bill. Through the window, he could see Ruby herself arranging fresh flowers in small vases on each table, a splash of color against the chrome and red vinyl backdrop. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing down his collar. After his late-night shift, he'd managed a few hours of sleep before changing into his one decent button-down shirt, the blue one his mother had given him last Christmas. The morning's first fare had cancelled, giving him time to arrive early for his meeting with Rebecca. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Ruby looked up, her face brightening with recognition. "Well, if it isn't Bill's guardian angel," she called out, setting down her flowers. "Coffee's fresh, hun. Your usual booth is open." Jack felt, his face warm at the nickname. "Thanks, Ruby. I'm actually meeting someone. Bill's daughter." "Rebecca?" Ruby's smile widened. "Known that girl since she was knee-high to a grasshopper. She called ahead, running about 10 minutes late. Something about her son's soccer practice." Jack settled into the corner booth, accepting a steaming mug of coffee from Ruby. He pulled out his father's ledger, more out of habit than necessity, and began reviewing last night's fares. The extra hours had helped, but he was still well short of what he needed for his mother's medications. The bell chimed again. Jack looked up to see a woman in her mid-30s entering the diner. She had Bill's eyes and carried herself with the same military precision, though she wore business casual attire instead of a veteran's cap. A leather messenger bag was slung across her shoulder, and she scanned the diner with purpose. "Jack Reynolds?" she asked, approaching his booth. Her handshake was firm, professional. "I'm Rebecca Cooper. Thank you for meeting me." As she slid into the booth, Ruby appeared with another coffee mug and a knowing smile. "The usual for you too, Becca?" Thanks, Ruby. It's been that kind of morning. Once Ruby had left, Rebecca turned her full attention to Jack. Up close, her resemblance to Bill was even more striking. Not just in her features, but in the way she seemed to carry an invisible weight on her shoulders. "My father told me what you're doing for him," she began, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "The free rides, the breakfast meetings. I need you to understand something, Mr. Reynolds. Dad hasn't opened up to anyone like this since Mom passed 3 years ago." Jack shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the intensity of her gaze. "He's a good man. He deserves better than what he's going through." Rebecca nodded slowly. "That's just it. Do you know what he said to me yesterday? He said you reminded him of Tommy Martinez. His commanding officer? His best friend, the one who didn't make it back." Rebecca reached into her messenger bag and pulled out a worn envelope. "Dad gave me this last night, asked me to show you." Inside the envelope was a photograph Jack hadn't seen during Bill's previous sharing. It showed a younger Bill standing next to another soldier, both of them laughing at something off camera. The other man had an arm slung around Bill's shoulders, his face radiating the kind of joy that only comes from complete trust in another person. "Tommy saved his life twice in Vietnam," Rebecca continued, her voice soft. "The second time cost Tommy his own. Dad's carried that weight ever since, but yesterday he told me something changed. Said meeting you reminded him that there's still good in the world, still people willing to carry others when they need it." Jack stared at the photograph, at the frozen moment of friendship and brotherhood. Ruby arrived with their breakfast. Plates, but neither of them moved to eat. "There's more," Rebecca said, pulling out a laptop from her bag. "I'm a grant writer for the Portland Veterans Support Network. We've been trying to develop a program to help veterans access medical care, especially those who struggle with transportation. When Dad told me about you, about your father's karma rides." She paused, opening her laptop. "I think there might be a way we can help each other." For the next hour, Rebecca outlined her idea. The Veterans Support Network had funding available for innovative community support programs. What if they could expand Jack's informal arrangement with Bill into something bigger? A dedicated transport service for veterans needing medical care, built on the same principles of dignity and connection that Jack's father had established. "We can't offer much to start," Rebecca admitted, showing him the preliminary budget. "But it would be enough to cover your fuel costs and basic maintenance. More importantly, it would help us reach veterans who've been falling through the cracks." Jack's mind raced with possibilities. He thought about his father's ledger full of karma rides, about Bill's photographs of brothers supporting each other, about Miguel's mother's different kind of calculator. "There's one more thing," Rebecca said, closing her laptop. "Dad doesn't know I'm meeting with you. He's proud, stubborn. He'd never want to feel like he inspired a charity project. But this isn't charity, is it, Jack? This is about community, about carrying each other home." Before Jack could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from his sister. "Pete from the pharmacy called, said to thank you for the overnight deliveries you offered. Jack, the discount he's giving us for Mum's meds." How did you manage that? Looking at the message, then at Rebecca's expectant face, Jack felt something click into place. His father had always said that taxi drivers were part therapist, part tour guide, and part guardian angel. Maybe this was what he'd meant. Not just giving rides, but building bridges between people who needed each other. "Your father," Jack said finally, meeting Rebecca's gaze. "He showed me pictures of his unit yesterday. Talked about how they carried each other through the worst times. Maybe that's what we're supposed to do now. Carry on that tradition, just in a different way." Rebecca's smile was radiant. "So you'll consider it?" "On one condition," Jack said, pulling out his father's ledger. "We keep the karma rides going, not just for veterans, but for anyone who needs them. My dad believed that kindness creates its own kind of wealth. I think he was right. Rebecca extended her hand across the table. Deal. Now, let's figure out how to tell my father without him trying to talk us both out of it. As they bent over the laptop, planning and dreaming, neither of them noticed Ruby watching from behind the counter, a knowing smile on her face. She'd seen a lot of stories unfold in her diner over the years, but something told her this one was special. Outside, the morning sun had broken through Portland's clouds, casting long shadows across the city streets. In those shadows, countless stories were unfolding, stories of struggle and hope, of kindness given and returned. And in a corner booth of a retro diner, two people who had started as strangers were weaving those stories together into something new, something that would ripple out to touch lives they hadn't even met yet. The universe, it seemed, had its own way of multiplying acts of kindness, of turning small moments of generosity into movements that could change a community. And it all started with a taxi driver saying no to a fare, saying yes to something bigger than himself. The Portland Veterans Support Network office occupied a modest suite in a renovated warehouse near the Pearl District. Jack parked his taxi in the visitor's lot, noting how the morning sun caught the building's restored brick facade. He'd driven past this place countless times without ever knowing what happened inside its walls. It had been 3 days since his meeting with Rebecca at Ruby's, 3 days of running numbers, making calls, and trying to figure out how to tell Bill about their plans. Now, sitting in his taxi and watching other cars pull into the lot, Jack felt the weight of what they were about to attempt. His phone buzzed, a text from his sister Claire. Pete says 3 more veterans signed up for prescription delivery this week. Whatever you're doing, it's working. Mom's pills are covered through next month. Before he could reply, he spotted Rebecca walking toward his taxi. She wore a blazer today, looking every bit the professional grant writer, but her smile was warm and familiar as she approached. "Ready for this?" she asked, as Jack stepped out of the cab. "The board members are excited to meet you." The elevator ride to the 3rd floor was quiet, both of them lost in thought. Jack clutched his father's ledger like a talisman. He'd spent the previous night copying out some of the most meaningful Karma ride entries, trying to capture in words what his father had understood about community and connection. The conference room was already full when they entered. 8 people sat around a long table, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. Jack recognized one face immediately. Marcus Chen, a retired Marine who'd been a regular customer during late-night shifts at the VA hospital. "Jack Reynolds," Marcus called out, standing to shake his hand. "Should have known you'd be behind. Something like this. This man," he addressed the room, "drove me to physical therapy twice a week for a month last year. Wouldn't take a dime when he found out my benefits were delayed." Rebecca took charge of the introductions. Besides Marcus, there was Dr. Sarah Martinez, no relation to Bill's Tommy, but the coincidence felt meaningful. The VA hospital's head of patient services, James Wilson, a corporate lawyer who specialized in veteran affairs, and 5 other board members, each bringing their own expertise and connection to the veteran community. "Thank you all for coming," Rebecca began, her voice steady and professional. "As my proposal outlined, we're here to discuss a potential partnership that could transform how we approach veteran transportation services in Portland." She gestured. To Jack, Mr. Reynolds represents something unique, a second-generation taxi service that understands transportation isn't just about getting from point A to point B, it's about dignity, connection, and community support. Jack cleared his throat, suddenly aware of all eyes on him. He opened his father's ledger, then closed it again. Instead of reading his prepared notes, he decided to speak from the heart. "My father started Reynolds Family Taxi Service 20 years ago with 1 car and a simple belief that every ride was an opportunity to make a difference in someone's life. He kept track of what he called karma rides in this ledger. These weren't just free rides, they were investments in human connection. He paused, looking around the room. 3 days ago, I gave a free ride to a Vietnam veteran named Bill Cooper. That ride led me here, but it also taught me something my father knew all along, that sometimes the most valuable things we can offer each other can't be measured in dollars. Dr. Martinez leaned forward. We lose about 20% of our appointed patients to transportation issues, veterans who can't afford the ride, who don't have family support, who are too proud to ask for help. How would your program address this? For the next hour, Jack and Rebecca laid out their vision. It wasn't just about free rides, it was about creating a network of support. Jack explained how his conversation with Pete at the pharmacy had already spawned a medication delivery partnership. Rebecca detailed the grant funding available and how it could be structured to support a pilot program. But here's the key, Jack emphasized. This isn't charity, it's community. Every veteran who uses the service becomes part of the network. They share their stories, their experiences, their wisdom. We're not just driving people to appointments, we're rebuilding the kind of connections that make life worth living. Marcus Chen nodded slowly. Like the unit, he said. Taking a care of our own. Exactly, Rebecca agreed. And we already have proof of concept. Jack's work with my father has shown how this personal approach can make a difference. James Wilson, the lawyer, had been quiet throughout the presentation. Now he spoke up. The liability issues alone are considerable. Insurance, background checks, proper licensing, all covered in the proposal, Rebecca interjected smoothly. We're not starting from scratch. Reynolds Family Taxi Service is already licensed and insured. We're simply expanding its mission with proper support and structure. And your father? Dr. Martinez asked Jack. The one who started these karma rides, what would he think of this expansion? Jack felt his throat tighten. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the photograph he'd brought, the one of his father helping the elderly woman with her groceries. My father believed that a taxi was more than just a vehicle. It was a way to show people. They weren't alone. He passed away 3 years ago, but every day I try to live up to that legacy. This program, this would be a way to multiply that impact, to help more people feel supported and connected. The room fell quiet. James Wilson studied the proposal documents. Marcus Chen and Dr. Martinez exchanged thoughtful looks. The other board members whispered among themselves. Finally, Rebecca stood. We're not asking for an immediate decision. Take time to review the numbers, consider the impact. But remember, every day we wait is another day veterans in our community struggle to access the care they need. As the meeting wrapped up, Marcus pulled Jack aside. You know, when I was in the Marines, we had a saying, no one left behind. That sounds like your father understood that principle too. People began filing out of the conference room, but Dr. Martinez asked Jack and Rebecca to stay behind. Once the others had left, she closed the door and turned to them with an intense expression. I need to know something, she said. This program, are you ready for what it might become? Because if we do this right, it won't stay small. Word will spread. Other cities will want to replicate it. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? Jack thought about Bill's photographs, about his father's ledger, about all the stories waiting to be connected. My father used to say that doing the right thing always leads you where you need to go, even if the path isn't clear at first. Dr. Martinez smiled. I'll support this on one condition. We name it after your father, the Richard Reynolds Veterans Transportation Network, a legacy of karma rides writ large. As they left the building later, Rebecca turned to Jack. There's still one piece missing. We need to tell Dad. Jack nodded, checking his watch. He has an appointment tomorrow morning. I'll pick him up early, take him to Ruby's. Will you meet us there? Wouldn't miss it, Rebecca said. "Just be prepared. When Dad hears we've been planning this, behind his back." "We haven't been planning behind his back," Jack corrected gently. "We've been carrying on a tradition he helped inspire. Sometimes the best way to honor our heroes is to multiply their impact." As he drove home that evening, Jack's mind was full of possibilities. The meeting had gone better than he dared hope, but tomorrow's conversation with Bill would be the real test. How do you tell a proud veteran that his moment of vulnerability had sparked something bigger than himself? The answer, Jack suspected, lay in the stories, in Tommy Martinez's sacrifice, in his father's karma rides, in Bill's own journey of healing. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage aren't the ones that make headlines, but the quiet moments when we allow ourselves to be helped, to be connected, to be part of something larger than our own struggles. The sun was setting over Portland, painting the city in shades of gold and promise. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, Jack felt a deep sense of rightness. His father had always said that every ride was a story waiting to be told. Now it seemed those stories were about to become chapters in something even greater. Dawn was just breaking over Portland when Jack pulled up to Bill's house. The morning air was unusually crisp, carrying the first hints of spring. He noticed small changes in the property since his first visit. Fresh mulch in the flower beds, a newly painted mailbox, signs of renewed care and attention. Bill was already waiting on the porch, but something was different today. Instead of his usual casual attire, he wore his full military dress uniform, medals gleaming in the early light. The sight made Jack's heart skip. He hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for the weight of history the uniform represented. "Special occasion?" Jack asked as he helped Bill into the taxi. "Some days you just need to remember who you are," Bill replied cryptically, settling into the back seat. "Besides, had a feeling about today. Can't explain it." The drive to Ruby's was quiet, filled with an anticipation Jack couldn't quite name. He'd texted Rebecca earlier she would meet them there. His father's ledger sat on the passenger seat, along with the folder of proposal documents from yesterday's meeting. Ruby's eyes widened when they walked in, Bill in his uniform drawing respectful glances from other patrons. "Well, don't you clean up nice," she said, leading them to their usual booth. "Coffee's already on." They had just settled in when Rebecca arrived. She paused in the doorway, seeing her father in his uniform, and Jack noticed her eyes grow bright, with tears. Bill stood as she approached, military bearing perfect despite his cane. "Dad," she said softly, embracing him. "You haven't worn this since Mum's funeral." "Felt right today," Bill replied, his voice gruff with emotion. "Now, what's this all about? You two have been acting mysterious all week." Jack shared a look with Rebecca as Ruby brought their coffee. It was time. "Mr. Cooper," Jack began, then corrected himself. "Bill, remember when you showed me those photographs, the ones of your unit of Tommy Martinez?" Bill nodded slowly, his hand unconsciously moving to touch his medals. "You told me about how you carried each other, how the unit became family. Well, that got me thinking about something my father used to do." Jack pulled out the ledger, opening it to the pages. He'd marked. He called them karma rides. Over the next hour, as their breakfast grew cold, Jack and Rebecca laid out the whole story. The Veterans Support Network meeting, the grant proposal, the vision for the Jack Reynolds Veterans Transportation Network. They explained how Bill's story had inspired it all, how his willingness to accept help had shown them a way to help others. Bill sat in silence, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup, as they described the program's potential. Impact. When they finished, the silence stretched on, heavy with anticipation. Finally, Bill reached into his uniform jacket and pulled out a worn envelope, different from the one with the photographs. His hands trembled slightly as he placed it on the table. been carrying this for 40 years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Letter from Tommy Martinez's mother. She wrote it after I visited her, after I told her how her son died saving my life. He pushed the envelope toward Jack. Read it. With careful fingers, Jack opened the envelope and unfolded the yellowed paper inside. Dear Bill, Tommy always said that the measure of a life wasn't in how many days you lived, but in how many lives you touched. When he wrote about his unit, he called you his brothers. Not just fellow soldiers, but family. He died carrying you to safety, and in doing so, he showed us what love truly means. Don't carry the weight of his sacrifice as a burden. Carry it as a torch, lighting the way for others who need help finding their way home. With love and gratitude, Maria Martinez. Jack looked up to find Bill's eyes filled with tears. All these years, Bill said, I've been carrying that letter, trying to figure out how to honor Tommy's sacrifice, trying to be worthy of it. He straightened in his seat, medals catching the morning light. What you're proposing? It's not just about rides or medical appointments. It's about carrying each other home, just like Tommy did. Rebecca reached for her father's hand. Dad, we want you to be part of this. Not just as a participant, but as an advisor. These veterans need someone who understands, who's been where they are. Bill looked down at his uniform, then back at Jack. Your father, he understood this too, didn't he? About carrying people home. Jack nodded, thinking of all the karma rides recorded in the ledger. He believed every ride was a chance to make a difference, to show people they weren't alone. Then maybe it's time, Bill said slowly, to share some more stories. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small notebook. I've been keeping my own kind of ledger since I came home from Nam. Names, faces, stories of brothers who carried me when I couldn't walk on my own. Maybe these stories could help other veterans understand they're not alone either. Ruby appeared. At their table, coffee pot in hand, her own eyes suspiciously bright. More coffee, folks. On the house today. Some conversations deserve to be properly fueled. As she poured, Bill continued, his voice growing stronger. You know what Tommy used to say? He said that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing what's right anyway. Starting this program, it's going to be complicated, messy, but it's right. He turned to his daughter. Rebecca, you remember that box in the attic? The one with all my unit's papers, photographs, letters? Rebecca nodded. The one you never let anyone touch? Get it, Bill said firmly. It's time those stories came out of the dark. Time they helped light the way for others. Jack felt something shift in the air, a sense of pieces falling into place. This was more than just a transportation program now. It was becoming a mission, a way to connect generations of service members through their shared stories of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood. There's one more thing, Rebecca said, pulling out her laptop. The board wants to start a pilot program immediately. They've allocated funding for the first 6 months. She turned to Jack. They want Reynolds Family Taxi Service to be the cornerstone, your father's karma rides, expanded to serve veterans across Portland. Bill straightened his medals with careful fingers. Tommy would have liked that, using one act of kindness to spark a chain reaction of help. He extended his hand to Jack. Count me in, son. Let's carry some people home. As they shook hands, Jack noticed Ruby wiping tears from her eyes behind the counter. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across their table, but also illuminating the possibilities ahead. What had started as a simple free ride was transforming into something none of them could have imagined. But isn't that how the best stories often work? One small act of kindness, multiplied by courage and connection, growing into a movement that could change countless lives. Outside, Portland was coming alive with its usual morning bustle. But inside Ruby's diner, something extraordinary was taking shape. A legacy of karma rides and battlefield brotherhood, of fathers and sons, of veterans carrying each other home just as they had always done. The torch was being passed, and its light would soon reach further than any of them could imagine. 2 weeks after the meeting at Ruby's diner, Jack's taxi looked different. A small magnetic sign on each door now read, "Richard Reynolds Veterans Transportation Network, official partner," and the back seat held a neat stack of brochures about the program. But the biggest changes weren't visible from the outside. The early morning found Jack parked outside the VA hospital, reviewing his new dispatch tablet. The Veterans Support Network had provided it to help coordinate rides and track the program's impact. Today's schedule showed 3 veteran pickups, 2 medical appointments, and 1 pharmacy run. Next to each name was a small note about their service background, something Bill had insisted on. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Board meeting went great. 5 more veterans signed up yesterday. Dad's Vietnam story workshop starts next week. You coming?" Before Jack could reply, he spotted his first passenger of the day. Colonel Sarah Matthews walked with a slight limp, her silver hair catching the morning light. According to her profile, she'd served as a military nurse in Desert Storm. It was her first time using the program. "Mrs. Matthews," Jack called, stepping out to help with her bag. "I'm Jack Reynolds." "Colonel," she corrected automatically, then softened. "But Sarah is fine. Bill Cooper called me about this program, said I needed to stop being so stubborn about getting to my appointments." Jack smiled, remembering Bill's similar resistance just weeks ago. He's good at spotting stubborn people. Must be all that military training. As they drove, Sarah gradually opened up. She'd been missing appointments because her arthritis made driving difficult, but she'd refused to burden her children. "Funny thing about serving," she mused, looking out the window. "They teach you to be strong, to handle everything yourself. Sometimes we forget that asking for help takes its own kind of strength." Jack thought about his father's ledger, now sitting proudly in the program's new office. "My dad used to say that everyone's fighting their own battles. The trick is finding people who understand your war." Sarah turned to him, something shifting in her expression. "Your father sounds wise. Tell me more about these karma rides of his." By the time they reached her appointment, Sarah had shared stories about her time in military hospitals, about the soldiers she'd cared for, about the weight of responsibility that never quite leaves. As Jack helped her out of the taxi, she pressed something into his hand, a small military nursing pin. "For your collection," she said. Bill mentioned, "You're gathering veteran stories. This one has its own." The pin joined others on the taxi's sun visor, small tokens from veterans who'd ridden with Jack over the past 2 weeks. Each one came with a story, a piece of history, a fragment of someone's journey home. Later that morning, Jack picked up Miguel from his night shift at the office building. Though not part of the veterans program, Miguel had become one of Jack's regular karma rides since that rainy night conversation. "Business looks good," Miguel noted, gesturing to the new signs. "Your padre would be proud." Jack nodded, thinking about how much had changed. The program was already helping him stay afloat financially. But more importantly, it had given him a sense of purpose he hadn't even known he was missing. "Got something to show you," Miguel said as they neared his apartment. "Remember that corporate client I helped you get? They want to expand the contract. Their HR department heard about the veterans program. They want to donate rides for employees who are military families." Jack felt a familiar warmth in his chest, the kind that came when his father's beliefs about karma were proven right. One act of kindness continuing to ripple outward, touching lives in unexpected ways. At noon, he met Bill at Ruby's for their now regular lunch meeting. The older veteran looked energized, despite his ongoing treatments. The story workshop he was organizing had given him new purpose. "Got 15 veterans signed up already," Bill reported over coffee. Each one with a different perspective, different era of service. But the themes are the same: sacrifice, brotherhood, the struggle to come home. "Speaking of coming home," Jack said, "I've been thinking about something you said about Tommy Martinez, about carrying each other." Bill's expression softened at his friend's name. "What if we expanded the program? Not just medical appointments, but helping veterans get to job interviews, family events, anything that helps them stay connected to their community. Like what your father did with his karma rides," Bill nodded. "Supporting the whole person, not just their medical needs." "Exactly. Rebecca thinks we could modify the grant to include it." Bill was quiet for a moment, studying his coffee cup. "You know, when I first got in your taxi, I was at one of my lowest points. The medical bills, the lonely nights, the feeling that my best days were behind me." He looked up, his eyes bright with purpose. "Now I'm helping other veterans tell their stories, watching this program grow. Sometimes the best medicine isn't what they give you at the hospital. It's finding a mission again." Ruby appeared with fresh coffee, having long since given up charging either of them for refills. "Speaking of mission," she said, "I've been talking to some of my regulars about the program. Got 3 more veterans interested. And, she hesitated, then continued. "I've been thinking about my own father, never talked much about his time in Korea, but maybe if something like this had existed." Jack reached for his tablet, ready to add more names to the growing list. As he did, he caught his reflection in the diner's window and almost didn't recognize himself. The weight of financial stress that had haunted his features was replaced by something else: purpose, confidence, the look of someone who had found his calling. His phone buzzed again, Claire this time. "Just left Mom's doctor appointment. They're amazed at her progress. Said having reliable transportation to treatment makes such a difference. Jack, what you're doing with this program, it's changing lives." That afternoon, Jack picked up a young veteran named Marcus for his physical therapy appointment. Marcus had lost his leg in Afghanistan, and his profile noted he was struggling with depression. But today, something was different. "Went to Bill's story workshop yesterday," Marcus said as they drove. "First time I've really talked about what happened over there. First time I felt like anyone could truly understand." Jack thought about Tommy Martinez's mother's letter, about carrying each other's stories as a way of carrying each other home. "That's what this is all about," he said, "making sure no one walks their path alone." Marcus nodded, fingering a small medallion he wore. "Been thinking about something Colonel Matthews said at the workshop, about how every generation of veterans has its own war, but we're all fighting the same battle, the one to find our way back." As the day wound down, Jack made one final stop: his father's grave. He hadn't been here in months, but today felt right. The setting sun cast long shadows across the cemetery as he placed a small American flag next to the headstone. "You were right, Dad," he said softly. "About the karma rides, about every fair being a story, about how doing the right thing leads you where you need to go. We're carrying on your legacy, but it's become something bigger than either of us could have imagined." Driving home, Jack reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. His taxi wasn't just a taxi anymore. It was a rolling testament to the power of connection, of shared stories, of people carrying each other through dark times. The financial struggles weren't completely gone, but they seemed less daunting now, balanced against the wealth of purpose he'd found. Tomorrow would bring new veterans, new stories, new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, Jack Reynolds son of Richard Reynolds, keeper of Karma rides and carrier of veterans' stories, drove through his city with a heart full of gratitude for where this journey had led him. 1 month into the Richard Reynolds Veterans Transportation Network program, Jack arrived at the VA hospital to find an unexpected scene. A small group of veterans had gathered in the parking lot, sharing coffee and stories before their appointments. He recognized faces from Bill's workshop, from his regular rides, from the growing community that had sprung up around what had started as a simple act of kindness. Colonel Matthews, Sarah, as she now insisted Jack call her, was holding court near a bench, her military nursing pin now accompanied by several others on her jacket. She'd become something of a mother figure to the younger veterans, especially those struggling with medical challenges. "There's our guardian angel," she called out as Jack parked his taxi. "Got room for one more story today?" Jack stepped out, noting how the morning sun caught the new magnetic signs on his taxi doors. In just 4 weeks, they'd gone from a single car to a network of 3, his original taxi, plus 2 more local drivers who'd been inspired to join the program. Each vehicle bore both the program's name and his father's motto. "Every ride is a story waiting to be told." "Always room for more stories," Jack replied, accepting a cup of coffee from Marcus, the young Afghanistan veteran who now helped coordinate the workshop schedule. "What's on your mind?" Sarah's eyes twinkled. "Remember that corporate contract Miguel helped you get? Well, one of their employees, Jennifer from HR, has a son in the Marines. She came to Bill's workshop last week, heard about what we're doing here. This morning, she called to tell me her company wants to sponsor a 4th car for the program." Before Jack could respond, his phone buzzed. It was Rebecca. "Emergency board meeting in an hour. Good news, really good news. Can you come?" As Jack read the message, Bill emerged from the hospital entrance, moving with more energy than Jack had seen in weeks. The treatments were working, but Jack suspected the real medicine had been the sense of purpose the program had given him. "Got your message about the board meeting," Bill called out. "But first, you need to hear what happened at yesterday's workshop." The story workshop had evolved beyond their initial expectations. What started as a small group of Vietnam veterans sharing experiences had grown into an intergenerational gathering of service members, their families, and community supporters. They now met twice weekly in a room donated by Ruby's church, with Bill and Sarah leading sessions that often ran over their scheduled time. "Young Marine came in yesterday," Bill continued, his eyes bright with emotion. "Just back from his 3rd tour, hadn't spoken more than a few words to anyone in months," according to his mother, but something about the stories, about seeing others, who understood. He paused, collecting himself. By the end of the session, he was sharing his own experiences. His mother was in tears. Jack thought about his father's ledger, now displayed prominently in the program's office. Richard Reynolds had believed in the power of small kindnesses to change lives, but even he couldn't have imagined how far those ripples would spread. The morning's ride schedule was full, but Jack had learned to expect the unexpected. As he helped Sarah into the taxi for her appointment, she handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Open it later," she said mysteriously, "when you get to the board meeting." The drive to Sarah's appointment was filled with updates about the program's growing impact. The pharmacy partnership with Pete had expanded to include 3 more locations. The story workshop had caught the attention of a local newspaper, and most importantly, veterans who had been isolated were finding their way back to community. "You know what the best part is?" Sarah mused as they neared the medical center. "It's not just about the rides anymore, it's about belonging. Every time one of us shares a story, helps another veteran, or simply shows up to listen, we're rebuilding something that many of us lost when we left the service." After dropping Sarah off, Jack headed to the Veteran Support Network office for the emergency board meeting. The package she'd given him sat on the passenger seat, an intriguing mystery. The conference room was packed when he arrived. Rebecca sat at the head of the table, practically bouncing with excitement. Dr. Martinez was there, along with James Wilson and several new faces Jack didn't recognize. "Before we start," Rebecca announced, "Jack needs to open something." She nodded at the package in his hands. Carefully unwrapping the brown paper, Jack found a leather-bound book. Opening it, he caught his breath. The pages were filled with handwritten stories, dozens of them, each one signed by a veteran who had used the program. Some were long, detailed accounts of service and struggle. Others were simple messages of gratitude. But together, they formed a new kind of ledger, a continuation of what his father had started. "Sarah and Dad have been collecting these," Rebecca explained. "But that's not why we called this meeting." She paused for effect. "The State Veterans Affairs Office got wind of our program. They want to use it as a model for other cities. They're offering funding to expand across Oregon." The room erupted in excited discussion. James Wilson started outlining legal considerations. Dr. Martinez began calculating potential impact numbers. But Jack found himself looking at Bill, who sat quietly observing it all. "What are you thinking?" Jack asked him softly. Bill smiled, touching the medals he now wore regularly to the workshops, thinking about Tommy Martinez, about how saving one life can end up saving many others, about how your father's karma rides and my unit's story of brotherhood somehow merged to create all this. Jack nodded, understanding. Every person in this room, every veteran who had shared their story, every family member who had found hope, they were all part of a chain reaction that started with a simple choice to help someone in need. "There's more," Rebecca continued, regaining everyone's attention. "Ruby's church has offered us permanent space for the workshops. They want to create a veterans community center, and 3 more taxi companies have reached out about joining the program." As the meeting continued, Jack's phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "Mum's doctor says she's in remission. She says it's because she never had to miss a treatment. Jack, you started something amazing." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Jack gave rides to 5 more veterans, each one adding their own story to the growing tapestry of healing and hope. Marcus coordinated the afternoon workshop session. Ruby hosted an impromptu celebration dinner for Bill's latest clean medical report. That evening, as Jack parked his taxi outside his apartment, he noticed something different. The Reynolds family taxi service decal, though still faded, seemed to shine in the setting sun. Below it, the new magnetic sign proclaimed their mission to the world. But it was more than just words on a car door. It was proof that his father had been right all along. Taking out his keys, Jack felt the weight of the leather-bound book of stories in his bag. He thought about all the lives that had intersected because of one decision to give a free ride to a veteran on a rainy morning. Each story in that book was a testament to the power of connection, of shared understanding, of carrying each other home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new stories to add to both his father's ledger and this new collection. But tonight, Jack Reynolds, son of Richard Reynolds, carrier of veterans and keeper of their stories, felt the profound rightness of where this journey had led him. Above Portland, the stars were beginning to appear, each one a point of light in the darkness. Like the stories they were collecting, like the lives they were touching, like the community they were building, one small light at a time, illuminating the way home for those who needed it most. The call came on a quiet Sunday afternoon, 6 weeks into the program. Jack was reviewing the next week's schedule when his phone lit up with an unfamiliar Washington, D.C. area code. He almost let it go to voicemail. Sunday was usually his day to catch up on paperwork and visit his mother, but something made him answer. "Reynolds Family Taxi Service," he said, keeping his voice professional despite the day off. "Mr. Reynolds?" The voice was crisp, authoritative. "This is Colonel James Harrison from the Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington. Do you have a moment to talk about your Veterans Transportation Program?" Jack sat up straighter in his father's old office chair. They'd converted his childhood bedroom into a small home office, and the walls were now covered with maps showing the program's growing coverage area, photos from Bill's workshops, and the ever-expanding collection of military pins and patches donated by veteran passengers. "Of course, sir," Jack replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll get straight to the point," Colonel Harrison continued. "Your program has caught our attention. The combination of practical support and community building, it's something we've been looking for. I'm flying to Portland tomorrow. I'd like to see this operation firsthand." After hanging up, Jack sat in stunned silence. His eyes fell on his father's ledger, now accompanied by 3 more volumes documenting the program's rides and stories. The leather-bound book of veterans. Stories that Sarah had given him sat beside them, already half full with new entries. His phone buzzed again, Rebecca this time. "Just got a call from DC, you too?" They agreed to meet at Ruby's right away. The diner had become their unofficial headquarters, with Ruby keeping a corner booth permanently reserved for program business. When Jack arrived, he found not just Rebecca, but Bill, Sarah, and Marcus already gathered there. "Got the call too," Bill said as Jack slid into the booth. He was wearing his dress uniform again, the medals catching the afternoon light streaming through the window. "Colonel Harrison. I served with his father in Vietnam." Ruby appeared with coffee and her famous apple pie, refusing payment as always. "This one's on the house," she insisted. "We're celebrating something big. I can feel it." As they discussed the upcoming visit, Jack noticed how much had changed in just 6 weeks. Bill's health had improved dramatically. His doctors attributed it as much to his renewed sense of purpose as to the treatments. Sarah had started a support group for veterans' families, running it alongside the story workshops. Marcus was talking about going back to school, inspired by the younger veterans he'd been mentoring. "There's something else," Rebecca said, pulling out her laptop. "Remember that corporate sponsorship Jennifer arranged? Well, her company's parent corporation got wind of it. They want to create a foundation to support programs like ours nationwide. They're talking about significant funding." Jack thought about his father's voice. "Sometimes the biggest tips come from the rides you give for free." The simple act of refusing payment from Bill that rainy morning had sparked something far beyond anything he could have imagined. "We need to show Colonel Harrison the real heart of this program," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Not just the logistics and numbers, but the stories, the connections, the way lives are being changed." "I have an idea," Marcus chimed in. "Tomorrow's workshop was going to be special anyway. It's the first time we're having active duty service members join us. What if we invited the Colonel to attend?" They spent the next hour planning. Ruby offered to cater the workshop. Bill would wear his uniform to present the growing collection of veterans' stories. Sarah would coordinate with the families who'd been impacted by the program. As they brainstormed, Jack's phone lit up with a text from his sister Claire. "Just heard about the DC visit from Mom's veteran support group. They want to tell their stories too. This is bigger than just transportation now, isn't it?" Looking around the table at these people who had become like family, Jack felt a sudden clarity. This was about more than rides or workshops or even stories. This was about rebuilding the kind of support system that existed in military service. The unshakable knowledge that someone had your back, that you weren't walking alone. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Jack arrived at the VA hospital early to pick up his first passenger of the day. A young Marine sergeant named David Chen, recently returned from overseas and struggling to adjust. As they drove to his appointment, David was quiet, but Jack noticed him studying the collection of pins and patches on the visor. "Each one has a story," Jack said softly. "Just like each of us." David touched a Marine Corps pin someone had donated. "My squad leader used to say something similar. Said every Marine carried not just their own story, but the stories of everyone who'd helped them become who they are." When they arrived at the hospital, David hesitated before getting out. "The workshop today, is it really okay for active duty to attend?" Jack smiled, remembering Bill's similar uncertainty weeks ago. "More than okay. It's necessary. The stories need to be passed on, the connections maintained. It's how we carry each other home." Throughout the morning, Jack gave rides to veterans new and old, each one adding to the tapestry of experiences that made up their growing community. Colonel Harrison's flight wasn't due until afternoon, but the energy of anticipation filled every interaction. At Ruby's, preparations were in full swing. The church hall next door, now officially the Veterans Community Center, was being set up for the largest workshop gathering yet. The walls were lined with photographs, not just of military service, but of the program's impact. Veterans helping veterans, families supporting families, a community coming together to ensure no one walked alone. Bill arrived early, carrying a box of newly bound story collections. "Had these rushed for today," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Figured the colonel should see what his father's generation started and how we're carrying it forward." Sarah and her family support group had created a display showing the ripple effects of the program, how helping one veteran get to medical appointments often led to helping entire families rebuild their lives. Marcus had prepared a presentation about their mentorship initiatives, showing how younger veterans were finding purpose in helping others. By early afternoon, the center was filled with people from all walks of life. Elderly veterans in VFW caps, active duty service members in crisp uniforms, family members wearing pins and patches, honoring their loved one's service. Ruby had outdone herself with the catering, and the smell of coffee and home-baked cookies filled the air. When Colonel Harrison arrived, Jack was struck by how young he seemed for his rank. But there was a depth of understanding in his eyes as he took in the scene. The mixed generations of service members, the wall of stories, the tangible sense of community. "My father," the colonel said quietly to Bill, he used to talk about the brotherhood he found in Vietnam, said he spent the rest of his life trying to recreate that sense of connection for other veterans. He gestured to the room full of people. "I think he would say, 'You've done it.'" As the workshop began, Jack stood at the back of the room, watching as stories were shared, connections were made, and healing continued. His father's ledger sat on a display table alongside the new collections of veterans' stories, a testament to how one simple act of kindness could grow into something transformative. Colonel Harrison moved through the crowd, listening, observing, occasionally wiping his eyes. He spoke with family members who described how the program had given them their loved ones back. He heard from veterans who had found purpose in helping others. He saw active duty service members realizing they weren't alone in their struggles. Near the end of the day, the colonel pulled Jack aside. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "what you've created here, it's exactly what we've been looking for. A model that combines practical support with emotional healing, that bridges generations of service, that rebuilds the bonds of brotherhood and extends them into the civilian world." He paused, looking around the room. "We want to help you take this national, not just the transportation program, but all of it, the workshops, the story collections, the family support groups. The VA is prepared to provide significant funding and resources. Jack thought about his father's belief in karma rides, about Bill's story of Tommy Martinez's sacrifice, about all the interconnected threads that had led to this moment. "Sir," he replied carefully, "we'd be honored. But we need to maintain the personal touch. This works because it's about connection, about carrying each other's stories, about making sure no one walks alone." The colonel smiled. "Couldn't agree more. That's exactly why we want your help. Your father's karma rides, Bill's workshop, model, Sarah's family support system, they're all pieces of something bigger, something that could help veterans across the country find their way home." As the sun set over Portland, casting long shadows through the center's windows, Jack looked at the community gathered there. What had started as a single act of kindness had grown into something far beyond his imagining. But at its heart, it remained true to his father's simple belief. Every ride is a story waiting to be told, and in the telling, we find our way back to each other. 1 year to the day after Jack had first refused payment from Bill Cooper, the Richard Reynolds Veterans Transportation Network had transformed beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The morning sun rose over Portland, illuminating the new sign on the building that had once been Ruby's Church Hall. Reynolds Martinez Veterans Community Center. Jack parked his original taxi, now semi-retired for special occasions, in his usual spot. The lot was already filling up with vehicles bearing the program's logo, each one representing a story of connection and hope. Through the center's windows, he could see Bill setting up for the day's special workshop session. His phone buzzed with a morning text from Rebecca. "Can't believe it's been a year. Dad's already here, wearing his uniform, of course. Says he has a surprise for everyone." The past 12 months had been a whirlwind of growth and change. With the VA's support and corporate sponsorship, the program had expanded to 15 cities across the country. Each location followed the Portland model, combining transportation, assistance with story workshops, family support groups, and the deep sense of community that had made the original program so successful. But today wasn't about national expansion or governmental support. Today was about remembering how it all began, with one taxi driver, one veteran, and one simple act of kindness. As Jack entered the center, he was struck by how much the space had evolved. The walls were now covered with hundreds of photographs and stories. Veterans from World War II to recent conflicts shared space with family members, supporters, and active duty service members. A special display near the entrance held his father's original ledger alongside the growing collection of veterans' storybooks. "There he is!" Bill's voice boomed across the room. The older man moved with surprising agility now, his health vastly improved over the past year. He still attended his treatments twice a week, but these days he drove himself in one of the program's vehicles, insisting on giving rides to other veterans along the way. Sarah Matthews, now the national coordinator for the family support program, stood nearby arranging coffee and Ruby's famous pastries. "Just got off the phone with the Seattle Center," she reported. "Their first story workshop starts today. The template you and Bill created is spreading like wildfire." Marcus, who had indeed returned to school, was setting up a video link for centers across the country to join the day's celebration. He'd become the program's technology guru, creating digital platforms for veterans to connect and share their stories between in-person meetings. Ruby herself bustled around, somehow managing to be everywhere at once, despite having officially retired to focus on the program's hospitality services. "Just like old times," she said, pressing a coffee into Jack's hands. "Remember that morning when you and Bill first came in? Who would have thought?" The center began filling with familiar faces. Pete from the pharmacy, whose medication delivery partnership had become a national model. Miguel, whose late-night conversation had helped spark the corporate sponsorship. Jennifer from HR, whose company's foundation now supported veterans programs across the country. Colonel Harrison had flown in from Washington for the occasion. He stood chatting with Claire and their mother, whose cancer remained in remission. The colonel had become more than just a program supporter. He'd become part of their extended family, often sharing his own father's Vietnam stories in workshop sessions. "Attention, everyone!" Bill's voice cut through the growing buzz of conversation. He stood at the front of the room, resplendent in his dress uniform. "Before we start today's official celebration, there's something you all need to see." He nodded to Rebecca, who wheeled out something covered with a cloth. With careful movements, Bill removed the covering to reveal a beautifully crafted wooden display case. Inside was a purple heart, Tommy Martinez's purple heart. Tommy's family. "Sent this last week," Bill explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Said it belonged here, where his spirit of carrying others home lives on. But that's not all." He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a letter. "This arrived yesterday from the President. The Richard Reynolds Veterans Transportation Network has been selected for the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Not just for the lives we've touched, but for changing how this country thinks about veteran support and community healing." The room erupted in cheers and tears. Jack felt a hand on his shoulder, Rebecca, her eyes shining with pride and gratitude. "But none of this," Bill continued once the noise had settled, "would have happened without one moment, one choice, one person believing in the power of karma rides and carrying each other home. Jack Reynolds, would you come up here?" As Jack moved through the crowd, he felt the weight of all the stories in the room, each person touched by what had grown from that rainy morning decision. He thought about his father, about Tommy Martinez, about all the veterans who had shared their journeys of healing and hope. Bill embraced him in front of everyone. "A year ago, I was a broken man, thinking I had nothing left to give. You proved me wrong. You showed me that every one of us has something to offer, that we're all part of a continuing story of service and support." The celebration that followed was more than just a marking of time. It was a testament to the power of human connection. Veterans from the program's early days shared stories with newcomers. Family members who had once felt isolated found strength in their shared experiences. Active duty service members saw living proof that they would never have to walk alone. As the day wound down, Jack stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The setting sun painted Portland's skyline in shades of gold and promise. His taxi sat in its usual spot, the faded Reynolds Family Taxi Service decal still visible beneath the new program logo. His phone buzzed one last time, a message from an unknown number. Opening it, he found a photo of a taxi in San Diego bearing their program's emblem with a simple caption, "Just gave my first karma ride to a veteran. Now I understand what you meant about every ride being a story. Thank you for showing us the way home." Jack smiled, thinking about all the stories yet to be told, all the lives yet to be touched, all the connections yet to be made. What had started as one simple no to a fare had become a nationwide movement of hope and healing. Inside the center, the celebration continued, a symphony of laughter, tears, and shared purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new stories to add to their growing collection. But for now, Jack Reynolds, son of Richard Reynolds, keeper of karma rides and catalyst of change, stood in the gathering dusk and felt the profound rightness of where this journey had led them all. Up next on your screen are two more incredible stories that will touch your heart just like this one. Don't miss out. Click now to discover more tales of extraordinary kindness and life-changing moments. If this story moved you, these next two will leave you speechless. Just click and see for yourself.